Early Sunday morning on the island of Oahu. On a hilltop, Uncle Sam lay fast asleep, warned of the fire that was licking across the oceans from without, warned of the dangers that were threatening from within, tired from wrangling with his conscience and fatigued after a long, dark night full of disturbing events, as indeed the year 1941 was. He slept in the early Sabbath calm. Safe and secure behind its military and naval ramparts, the city of Honolulu, like many another unsuspecting American community, was also asleep. At all the Army and Navy establishments on the island, after repeated warnings from the War and Navy departments, a number 1 alert had secretly been in effect for 11 days. This alert provided suitable defense against possible acts of sabotage and uprisings within the island itself, but made no provision against attack or invasion. At Hickam Field, the Army's bomber base, precautions were taken to safeguard the equipment against sabotage. Hence, on this Sunday morning, the planes were concentrated in hangars or lined up row by row on the open field. Immediately adjacent to Hickam Field is Pearl Harbor, the Navy's $100 million fist. Here, on this morning of a tragic day of reckoning, capital ships, heavy and light cruisers, lay at anchor. At anchor, too, lay several destroyers, tenders, minesweepers, and repair ships, 86 vessels in all. By 7 o'clock, the city began to stir. For the most part, the atmosphere was serene and quiet. At Hickam Field, ground crews were at work. On a dock in Pearl Harbor, a few bluejackets idled away a few minutes. At Kaneohe, a field mass was being held.
Shipmates, today is the third Sunday of Advent, the 7th of December, which means that Christmas is not far ahead. I don't have to remind you fellows that the old Earline is about to shove off, carrying Christmas gifts and letters to the home side. Why not buy them a few presents? You might get Mother a Pikaki lei, a little sister a hula skirt. I think they'd rather have something from little Johnny out here in Hawaii. This is the time when you're going to be missed. So send them a present for Christmas. But that letter is so important, however. Don't put that off.
A few minutes past 7, an incident occurred at a temporary Army aircraft warning station. This station, as indeed the entire aircraft warning system, had officially closed at 7, but Private Joseph L. Lockhart, who had been receiving training here, was granted permission to remain at the station. While listening, he discovered something coming over the detector that alarmed him. He listened intently. Then, certain of his findings, he called the Central Information Center. An inexperienced lieutenant answered the phone.
Excuse me, sir. This is Private Lockhart. I believe a large flight of planes are approaching slightly east of north of Oahu at a distance of about 130 miles.
Must be our own. We're expecting some B-17s from the mainland.
Thank you, sir.
This incident, where it acted upon, would have given our forces brief but precious time for defense action, and may have considerably affected the events of this fateful day. Regrettably, Private Lockhart's warning went unheeded. It was 7:50 a.m. by the clock on the Aloha Tower when the drone of planes was faintly heard. Out of the misty Pacific skies, like tiny locusts, they swarmed in from the sea. From the south. From the southeast. At this very moment, on a quiet Sunday afternoon in Washington, Japan's smooth-talking, grinning envoys, Nomura and Kurusu, were blandly delivering to Mr. Hull a lengthy protestation of Japan's peace intentions. Yes, at this very deceitful moment, about 200 of Japan's messengers of death swooped in over our Pacific paradise. On they came, wave after wave, boldly, fearlessly. They had little to fear. They knew that our task forces were at sea, and they knew their disposition. They knew that no long-distance airplane reconnaissance, no inshore airplane patrol was being maintained. They knew from detailed maps they carried with them the exact location of vital airfields, hangars, and other structures. Each was given a specific objective, and straight toward that objective he came. Over the Koolau Range, past the Pali, Diamond Head, and over Waikiki Beach, the treachery of an empire was on the wing. Planned for months with brilliant cunning, favored by our lack of readiness, with the sky and sea all their own, at 7:55 a.m., hell broke loose. Man-made hell. Made in Japan.
battle station. God bless you.
with abandoned ship?
The ferocity of the attack momentarily subsided. In the city, the people, awakened by the bombardment, believed the Army and Navy were staging large-scale maneuvers. Scattered bombs, incendiaries, and machine gun fire had changed their minds. One gentleman, when interviewed by a reporter, was stubborn and refused to change his mind.
I don't think it is an attack by Japan.
But you must have seen the Japanese planes.
No, I did not.
What about the bombing and gunfire?
I thought the Army and Navy were having maneuvers.
Look, Mr. Kita, you know that I know that you know that this is an attack by Japan.
I have nothing to say.
And judging by the smoke pouring out of your chimney, there'll be nothing left to show.
I have nothing to say.
The second phase of the attack began. By 9:45, the attack was over. 1 hour and 50 minutes of perfidy. The last wave of the invaders was beaten off. Yes, beaten off by our men, who against overwhelming odds, heroically and magnificently gave notice to the world that we had only begun to fight. When they sneaked in, they were about 200 strong. Only about 150 when they departed. Behind them, they left about 50 of their planes. Most of them were scattered on the airfields in charred, twisted, and mangled wreckage. A few had crashed into the sea and were washed up on the shore. Some were shot out of the sky and plunged headlong into the harbor. Grim telltale evidence that the list of dead Japs might have been larger and the list of our casualties smaller had we been sufficiently on the alert. These two-man submarines, 3 of which were accounted for, were especially built to operate in shallow waters, such as are found in and around Pearl Harbor. This piece of underwater perfidy won't be forgotten. Yes, this, as indeed the whole diabolical plan of the attack, was conceived and aimed toward achieving one objective, and one objective only: to catch us off guard, smash our fleet, cripple our standing as a sea power, and put us out of business. In this it failed. So tragic and terrible was the scene of destruction. Heartbreaking, the sight of ships built to fight and die proudly, now left burning in shallow graves. Painful and lamentable the scenes at Hickam, Wheeler, Kaneohe, with barracks, hangars, and equipment a mass of battered debris. Always, said President Roosevelt, always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. In infamy, a record for all history to read in amazement, in sorrow, in horror and disgust. Those also were President Roosevelt's words. Horror and disgust, amazement and sorrow. Sorrow, yes. Bitter, grievous, mortifying sorrow. For on this Sabbath day, 2,343 officers and enlisted men of our Army, Navy, and Marine Corps gave their young lives in the service of our country. Who were these young Americans? Let us pause for a few minutes at their hallowed graves and ask a few of them to make themselves known. Who are you, boys? Come on, speak up, some of you.
I am Robert R. Kelly, United States Army. I came from Findlay, Ohio. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. James E. Kelly. I am Alfred Aaron Rosenthal, United States Navy. I lived in Brooklyn, New York. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. Henry L. Rosenthal. I am Theodore Stephen Zabel, United States Marine Corps. My hometown is Castalia, Iowa. Those are my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Zabel. I am Moses Anderson Allen, United States Navy. I lived on a farm in Cove, North Carolina. My mother is Mrs. Abby Allen. I am James Webster Late, United States Navy. I'm from Huntington Park, California. My folks are Mr. and Mrs. William J. Late. I am Antonio S. Tafoya, United States Army. I live just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. My father and mother are Mr. and Mrs. Jesus A. Tafoya. I am Lieutenant William R. Schick, United States Army Medical Corps. My home was Chicago, Illinois. My parents are Mr. and Mrs. William H. Schick. My wife's name is Lois.
You have a baby now, Lieutenant. He was born 3 months after Pearl Harbor. He's named after you, Billy. And you may be pleased to know he was born on your birthday.
Oh, that's swell. Thanks.
But tell me one thing, Lieutenant. How does it happen that all of you sound and talk alike?
We are all alike. We're all Americans.
Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy
23-year-old California, known affectionately to our Blue Jackets as the Prune Barge, with her ugly wounds temporarily bound, was refloated and towed to dry dock. Similar attention was given to the 28-year-old Nevada and the 21-year-old West Virginia. Here in dry dock, in record-breaking time, they were overhauled and improved from stem to stern, from hull to peak. Now, dressed in their up-to-the-minute fighting garb and raring to go, these mighty warriors and their proud crews stand out to sea. Godspeed. No phantom ships these, Mr. Tojo, but a huge convoy from the mainland. 36 ships, quite a number for blockade runners. And they're loaded to the gunwales with reinforcements and supplies. And here's a tip, Mr. Tojo. More of these convoys are on the way. Yes, convoy after convoy. Men in ever-increasing number. Supplies in ever-increasing quantity. For thanks to Washington's far-sighted program, we did manage before December 7th, despite many internal difficulties and disagreements, to build up the strength of our armed forces and start our factories humming. So that today, behind a heavy curtain of military censorship, Hawaii stands the greatest military and naval fortress in the world. Yes, virtually overnight, the island scene changed. War had come to America's tropical suburb. The Axis brand of war, a stab in the back Sunday morning. The din of the last bomb had barely faded when Governor Poindexter proclaimed martial law for the civilian population. Windows were taped in order to reduce the dangers from flying glass. Vital installations were camouflaged and protected by sandbags and barbed wire. Barbed wire, mountains of it, strung along every foot of Oahu's colorful coasts, strung across its highways, around its schools and its public buildings. Everywhere the earth was tunneled to provide shelter from shrapnel and strafing. Public squares, parks, and playgrounds were uprooted. Sturdy concrete shelters were built and distributed throughout the city. An efficient air raid warning system was put into operation, and for the first time in history, American school children were brought face to face with the grim reality of war. Thus, war came to Hawaii, USA. The Aloha Tower, once the symbol of welcome and hospitality, now stands clad in weird war paint. No longer do luxurious liners bring vacation-bent tourists to these once happy isles. The liners, too, have gone to war. No longer is Waikiki Beach the sun-kissed playground of the Pacific. Barbed wire has changed its face, too. Now, at twilight, the city streets are empty and deserted. Blackouts start each day promptly at dusk. Well, you may crow, Mr. Tojo. You've done a good job of stabbing in the back. You've darkened our cities. You've destroyed our property. You've spilled our blood. Our faith tells us that to all this treachery, there can be but one answer, a time-honored answer. For all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword.
patrol planes. Routine patrol. Only behind every cloud may be an enemy. Midway Island. Not much land, right enough. But it's our outpost. Your front yard. These are the natives of Midway. Tojo has sworn to liberate them. The birds seem nervous. There's something in the air. Something behind that sunset. Excitement this morning. The Dawn Patrol has sighted an enemy fleet. During the night, flying fortresses had landed at Midway.
An historic council of war is held.
That fellow's walk looks familiar. My neighbor's boy used to amble along just like that. Hey, is that one of them flying fortresses?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Why, that's young Will Kinney. He's from my hometown, Springfield, Ohio. He's not going to fly that great big bomber.
Yes, ma'am, that's his job. He's a skipper.
Will's dad is an engineer. 38 years on the old Ironton Railroad. And his mother, huh? Well, she's just like the rest of us mothers in Springfield or any other American town. And his sister, Patricia, well, she's about as pretty as they come.
I'll say so.
Well, Junior Kinney. Good luck. God bless you, son.
Suddenly, from behind the clouds, The Japs attack!
This really happened.
Meantime, our warships stalk the Jap fleet. Suddenly, the trap is sprung. Navy planes roared from the decks of our carriers. Army bombers, Marines, thundered destruction over a 300-mile battle area. invasion forces were hit and hit and hit again.
Men and women of America, here come your neighbor's sons, home from the day's work. You want to meet them. There's Jimmy Thatch, 7 meatballs on his plane.
How many more today, Skipper? Back at Midway, Tojo swore he'd liberate the natives. They seem just as free as they ever were. The Battle of Midway is over. Our front yard is safe. But a big job is still to be done. Day after day, our patrol planes search for survivors. Every tiny coral reef, every distant mile of sea. Search for men who fought to the last round of ammunition and flew to the last drop of gas and then crashed into the sea. 8 days, 9 days, 10 days without food or water.
His first cigarette.
Boy, that first drag sure tastes good.
$11 days. Well done, Matthew Hughes. Logan Ramsey. Frank Fessler.
That's 13 for Frank.
Boys to the hospital. Please do, quickly. Get them to clean cots and cool sheets. Get them doctors and medicine, a nurse's soft hands. Get them to the hospital. Hurry, please.
There was a hospital. Clean, orderly, 100 beds. And on its roof, the Red Cross plainly marked. The symbol of mercy the enemy was bound to respect.
The next morning, divine services were held beside a bomb crater that had once been a chapel. At eventide, we buried our heroic dead. The last salute from their comrades and their officers.
Captain Simard of the Navy. Colonel Shannon.
Major Roosevelt.
cartwheel took place in the South and Southwest Pacific areas. As cartwheel got underway, the situation was this. We had taken Guadalcanal in the Solomons and defeated the Japanese in the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea. We had thus blocked an enemy plan to cut us off from New Zealand and Australia. The next step was attack in 4 places at once. Nassau Bay in New Guinea, the islands of Woodlark and Kirrawina in the Solomon Sea, and at New Georgia in the Solomons themselves. Of the 4 attacks, New Georgia was the main event.
June 30th, 1943. The men of the reinforced 43rd Division made their landing on Rendova, a small island off the coast of New Georgia. The enemy had not expected a landing here. The men went ashore virtually unopposed. The entire landing was complete within 8 hours. There were only about 120 Japanese soldiers on the outlying island, but when they got over their initial surprise, they fought. In the first day, they lost some 50 or 60 men, about half their number. We lost 4. With enemy resistance under control, the main problem was to get supplies ashore and stockpiled for the main assault on New Georgia itself. In preparation for the move to New Georgia, heavy artillery was set up to pound the beaches across Blanche Channel. Early in July, the assault on New Georgia itself began, a beach-to-beach landing from Rendova. This is why we wanted New Georgia. Munda Point held a highly valuable airstrip from which we could soften up Bougainville, the next step in the march across the Pacific. Munda was a valuable prize, and it was going to cost us dearly. On New Georgia, our forces faced some of the most determined and well-commanded troops in the Japanese Army. The quality of the outnumbered enemy soon became clear as the push toward Munda airfield began. Our beachhead was only a couple of miles from Munda, but in the weeks which followed the landings, it was often a good day's work to advance 100 yards. More than once, our advance was pinned down for days at a time. Still, we kept pushing as reinforcements from the 37th and 25th Divisions came into the fight. But only when he could not hold another minute would the enemy pull back. It took us nearly a month to punch our way through the 2 miles of jungle to Munda airfield. But on August 5th, the 14th Corps sent word to Admiral Halsey that the airstrip was secure. The hardest part of the New Georgia fight was over, and immediately we began readying the cratered runways for use by the Army Air Corps. At the time, the objective of Operation Cartwheel wasn't known to the general public. We planned to move up along the coast of New Guinea, northwestward through the Solomons, and reduce the key Japanese stronghold at Rabaul on New Britain. Vella La Vella was the next step. In the first bypass maneuver of the Pacific War, we skipped over heavily fortified Columbangara and took its sister island, Vella La Vella. The enemy on Columbangara saw immediately that he was cut off and evacuated. The bypass tactic had proven its practicality. Meantime, at Port Moresby on New Guinea, the men of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment were getting ready to try another first in the Pacific, a vertical envelopment. The first airborne attack of the Pacific War was about to be mounted, under the personal direction of General MacArthur. The objective was an ideal site for a large airbase in the Markham Valley near the port town of Lae. Australian troops were already pushing down the New Guinea coast toward the port town as we prepared for the airdrop. The Aussie soldiers made steady progress toward Lae, confident that the airborne conquest of the Markham Valley would soon give them the other arm of a pincers which could force a large-scale enemy withdrawal. The Aussies' confidence was well placed. The 503rd, airborne on schedule, lifted off the runways at Port Moresby to swing toward the rugged peaks of the Owen Stanley Range. It was September 5th, 1943. The enemy had no idea that an airborne attack was coming. It took only 4.5 minutes for the C-47s to spill a regiment of men into the sky above the Markham Valley. As an airborne operation, it was almost textbook perfect. The drop took place on schedule, and regrouping on the ground was unopposed. 3 men were lost, and these through accidents in the jump itself. Swiftly engineered teams readied the valley floor for its new function as an Allied airfield. Just 2 days later, C-47s were flying in troops of the Australian 7th Division. They were to take the next step in securing this vital airfield site and a good-sized harbor at Lae to boot. The Australians moved out rapidly, pushing hard toward the sea and their rendezvous with the other Australian force. The Pincers was beginning its squeeze. For a week, the 2 Australian forces pressed the enemy, each trying to be the first in reaching the port town. Sometimes an enemy strong point would hold up their advance. But the Aussies knew how to do some pounding of their own. They were never halted for long. On September 16th, both arms of the Pincers met at Lae. The enemy saw the trap closing and pulled out. He would not return. We were a step closer to Rabaul, and Lae Harbor plus the new airfield would be stepping stones for the move forward. The first airborne operation of the Pacific War had been a highly profitable success. The next move was Admiral Halsey's, and the next stepping stone, Bougainville. Halsey's forces had already secured the Treasury Islands, and now troop ships and cargo vessels were on their way to Cape Turriquina, Bougainville. The Japanese were expecting them. The task of softening up Bougainville's beaches went to the Army Air Corps. Bougainville was to provide an air base within 200 miles of the enemy's stronghold at Rabaul. We planned to secure a beachhead and get fighter strips working to pound Rabaul before the Japanese could organize a counterattack. The landings went well. By nightfall, the Marines were prepared against the possibility of infiltration or surprise attack, but none came. Admiral Halsey, 2.5 weeks later, accompanied units of the 37th Division between November 8th and 24th to reinforce the Marines. The Jap Air Force, a few days later, made a major strike against our beachhead and succeeded in firing several of our gasoline and oil dumps. Until these losses were replaced, our troops carried on only limited operations towards extending our perimeter. General Griswold, commanding 14th Corps, began to step up our attacks against the Japanese.
mounted sharply as we beat down suicidal attempts to infiltrate our lines. The technique of jungle fighting was still new to our troops, yet in many instances we completely wiped out Jap units. Underground field hospitals were set up close to the front lines. Medics often performed surgical operations while enemy shells exploded within a radius of 50 yards. Engineers and Seabees, meanwhile, had begun building 3 airstrips. By January, 2 months after our initial landing, 2 runways for fighter planes and 1 for bombers were in operation. We utilized C-47 transport planes to supply our troops fighting in the forward areas. It was a welcome improvement over the drudgery of pack carrying through swamps and jungles. Our troops were fighting one of Japan's toughest outfits, the notorious 6th Division, commanded by the fanatical General Kanda, who had participated in the rape of Nanking. Captured enemy maps and documents tipped us off to an impending all-out attack against our beachhead. This was early in March, 4 months after our landing on Bougainville. The maps and documents gave us a general idea of the Jap plan of battle and probable jump-off date, March 10th. Before the Japs moved, we had redisposed our forces and coordinated all our positions. We were ready. In those hills were the Japs, hidden, watchful, waiting for the order to attack. With cool precision, our artillery met the first shock of the enemy's onslaught. Fanatically, the Japanese soldier attacked and attacked. For had not his commander declared, "We are invincible. No foe can equal our might." And had not he ordered, "Strike, strike, and strike again. Preserve our nation and our glory." For 4 weeks the battle raged, back and forth, up and down, attack, counterattack, retreat, advance, advance, until we killed more than 8,000 Japs. Our troops buried 5,370 of them. Those who had fled back into the hills could easily be kept immobilized. In May 1944, Bougainville, for all practical purposes, was ours. We had paid a price, too. But our living soldiers here on Bougainville found rest and recreation. The part played by Bougainville proved to be of priceless importance as our fighting forces struck closer and ever closer to the heart of the Japanese Empire.
Take it from the Marines, Tarawa was held. On the last day out, Father Francis Kelly celebrated Mass. 24 hours later, a lot of these fellows were dead. Every man aboard made his peace with God. Every Marine in the outfit, including the cameramen, knew as much about the operation as his CO. We were going out to take Bayshio Island, key to an atoll called Tarawa. D-Day was the 20th of November. There weren't any Jap airplanes around, but there's a Jap sub out there that the boys kept on the move. Our Army and Navy planes had been pacing the island for 5 days, and it didn't seem as though anyone on Bayshio could have lived through the bombing. And we weren't green. More than half of the task force were veteran pig stickers from Guadalcanal. The Navy pumped 2,800 tons of steel from Pennsylvania and Alabama in. We cut Tarawa open with stuff made in 48 states. Months of hard labor and precise machining went into this ammunition. We burned it up in minutes. Rabaul, the Marshals, Truk, and dozens of other Jap outposts will burn up millions more before the last shell is fired at Tokyo. The hand of every worker in America had touched some part of the mountains of equipment and supplies that were consumed in the destruction of this Jap garrison. The Japs were still answering our fire when we headed in. The water was choppy. These pictures are the first wave of ammunition about 1,000 yards from shore. We were heading straight in for the bloodiest operation in the history of the Marine Corps. But we thought it was going to be a picnic. That Jap gasoline came 3,200 miles from Tokyo. We'll soon replace it with gas from Texas, 6,000 miles away. Texas gas kept about 100 planes in the sky, blasting and strafing the Japs along the beach. The Japs began to get the range of the Higgins boat snagged on the reefs. We had to get out and wade 400 yards through terrific crossfire. A sniper was firing at these men. A few minutes after the landing, when the guys were hugging the beach, trying to get their wind after the 400-yard push, that piece of beach was all we had. That was our line for the rest of the day. In 1941, on Wake Island, a handful of unprepared Marines stood off a Jap task force for 16 days. For 15 months, these Japs on Tarawa had spent every day and night getting the island ready for this fight. But with the help of American-built equipment, we blotted out these sons of Tojo in 76 hours. We had the exits covered with machine gun and rifle fire, and the Japs kept coming out, trying to knock out the machine guns. Here comes one now. That sniper's got a beat on another. There's a squad up. camera tells the truth, but it doesn't give you any idea of how it smelled. And the smell on that island was bad. The wounded started going back 6 minutes after we hit the beach. The stretcher bearers, all members of the shore party, were the unsung heroes of Tarawa. Plenty of them got it. Stretcher bearers loaded the wounded onto rubber rafts and pushed them out to the Higgins boats off the reef. We couldn't leave them on the pier because of the snipers. We lost more than 1,000 dead and more than 2,000 wounded. On the third day, that Marine, the one without the helmet, was souvenir hunting when he found a couple of live Japs in that foxhole. The Japs lost 5,700 men, Imperial Japanese Marines, defending an island that wasn't 2 miles square. That gives you an idea of how important Tarawa was in their plan. Here's another spot where living, snarling rats are still dug into the ground. Blockhouses like this had 5 feet of concrete, buttressed with palm trunks, steel angle irons, sand, and coral rock. The Navy had tried to blast them out. The Air Force had tried to bomb them out. The Marines had tried to burn them out. But it took a bulldozer and a cat skinner to dig them out. This reception committee is all set for the first of these cornered Japs who decides to come out fighting. We brought in a few Japanese prisoners for intelligence. That sniper was nearly 6 feet tall. The prisoners had to be stripped to keep them from concealing weapons. They were sullen and hooked up over the idea that they were Supermen, even after they'd been captured. The Japs brought these captured Koreans to Tarawa to work as slaves. On the same day we rescued them, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek had guaranteed Korea her independence at the Cairo Conference. Thanksgiving Day. But we had a feeling that back home, the men and women who sent us the guns, the shells, and the Amtraks, the tools without which we never would have survived this day, were including us in their prayers. The wrecked Jap equipment we found had been brought in from all over, China, Malaya, Burma, Manchukuo. They had that 2x4 island loaded down with loot from every country they'd overrun. They even dragged captured British guns down from Singapore. None of it was much good to them after the second day of fighting, with the guns knocked out and the gunners dead. Almost immediately, Seabees were working on the 2 bomber strips on the island, and on the 4th day after we struck, Tarawa began to function as an advanced air base. Ensign Bill Kelly of Newcastle, Pennsylvania, brought in the first plane. The highly concentrated fighting on the bloody atolls of the Pacific gives vivid proof of the awesome price in men and materiel that must be paid for every forward step. We consume tons upon tons of the product of American hands. and leave the wreckage lying beside the graves of the brave men who have taken their last step toward Tokyo. To the survivors, we pledge an ever-growing stream of replacements being forged in war plants at home.
In China, the struggle continued. The reopening of the land bridge had to be accomplished. In the early part of 1944, the Supreme and Deputy Supreme Allied commanders met and laid out a plan of action for this reopening. The British Indian 14th Army in the Arakan, in order to hold the southern front more effectively, was to extend its frontier lines down the Akyab Peninsula. Simultaneously, Stilwell's Lido forces of Americans and Chinese were to speed up the Lido Road campaign with a drive on the strongholds of Mogong and Myitkyina. To aid in this purpose, the American marauders, led by Merrill, were placed under Stilwell. A third coordinating operation was a penetration from the air, in which Wingate's British and Indian Chindits were to be flown into the heart of Burma to land behind and cut enemy supply lines. For the fourth and last phase of the plan, the Chinese Yunnan force would strike from the China-Burma border across the mountains and jungles of the Salween River area in order to reopen the Burma Road for a juncture with the Lido Road. Now the plans were laid, and the stage set for the reopening of the Burma land bridge. The first step was taken on the Arakan front, when the 14th began its march down the Akyab Peninsula. The army moved rapidly toward the towns of Mongdaw and Buthadong. However, the Japs succeeded in carrying out a flanking movement on our lines of communication, and, moving by night, seized the Nagaduk Pass, through which went the main road connecting our forward troops with the rear. For some time, it looked as though they had succeeded in cutting off a complete advanced division. From there was opened an attack on the Jap positions in the Nagaduk Pass. Meanwhile, the 7th Indian Division, using tanks for the first time in this campaign, attacked the same objective in that vital pass. The 7th Indian Division finally succeeded in clearing the pass and relieving the beleaguered troops. Once again, our lines of communication were reopened. By the time the monsoon broke on the southern front in June, the 14th Army had destroyed nearly 7,000 of the Japs' finest troops, and it extended Allied lines to form a powerful defense block. The second blow for the reopening of the land bridge was struck by the Lido force in an offensive to push the Lido Road through Mogong to Myitkyina. To aid in the drive on Myitkyina, the American marauders acted as a flanking force, harassing the enemy in a series of left hooks. These marauders were seasoned jungle fighters, veterans of Guadalcanal, New Britain, and New Guinea. Men gathered together by a message which read, "The President of the United States has called for volunteers from experienced jungle troops for a dangerous and hazardous operation somewhere." On March 5th came the third blow, an aerial penetration of Burma. The plan was to fly a detachment of American engineers in gliders 200 miles into enemy-occupied territory and land them on jungle strips, which they would convert into airfields. Once these airfields were prepared, transport planes would fly in a force of Chindits. Patrols would then fan out, cut Jap communication lines, and harass the enemy from the rear. British General Wingate, in command of the Chindits, arrived at Lalagat to discuss final plans with American Colonel Phil Cochran of No. 1 Air Commandos. Rows of nylon tow ropes were carefully laid out, ready for the takeoff of dozens of twin-towed gliders. Supplies of all kinds were loaded, including bulldozers and equipment for the use of the American engineers in constructing airstrips in the jungle. The pilots and crews gathered to hear final instruction from Colonel Cochran.
Now, is there anything anybody doesn't know? If there is, let's get it straight now. Okay, now just before I came over here, I had our final meeting with the British ground troops that you're going to take in there tonight. And I talked to the guy that's got the red flare that you know is going to be shot off if there's too much interference with the first few gliders that land. And he tells me that that flare's in an awful deep pocket, and it's going to take somebody an awful lot of finding to get at it. So, if those guys have got that kind of heart, and they got that kind of guts, it's up to us to get them in there so they can do their job and get them in right. Now, tonight, your whole reason for being, your whole existence is going to be jammed up into a couple minutes, and you're just going to balance it there, and it's going to take your character to bring it through. Now, nothing you've ever done before in your life means a thing. Tonight, you're going to find out you've got a soul. Good luck.
The transport stood ready for takeoff. Gliders were lined up. Suddenly, there appeared in the sky above a plane returning from a last-minute reconnaissance flight. Something was wrong. Photos revealed that the main field was hopelessly obstructed. Tree trunks and logs had been strewn over it so that glider landings on this field were impossible. The troops waited for Cochran and Wingate to make a decision. It wasn't long in coming. Within 15 minutes, they were climbing into the gliders. An alternative strip known as Broadway was now to be the main airbase. At dusk, the first planes took off, each transport towing twin gliders. And within them, men sat silently, grimly, waiting for what lay ahead. When the sun rose over Broadway, it revealed a field littered with wounded gliders. There were wounded men, too, and some beyond wounds. The first glider had bumped to a halt on a field rutted by buffalo bogs and elephant footprints, and strewn with large teakwood logs, hidden from the eyes of reconnaissance cameras by the tall grass. A second glider came in, then a third. They followed one another so fast that it was impossible to clear the field of obstructions and the wrecked gliders. The wounded were tended on the field. Patrols fanned out through the jungle to give protection to the small band of engineers and wounded. They buried their dead in the Burmese jungle. Their Burmese padre read the last rites, and his words mingled with the sound of bulldozers and tractors leveling the field, for the arrival that night of the first flight of transports, carrying the remainder of the airborne troops. By that afternoon, the engineers had completed their work. Broadway was open for business. That night and for 6 successive nights, RAF and American pilots of the Troop Carrier Command, led by Brigadier General William D. Old, flew back and forth between Lalagat and the jungle strip of Broadway, which became a base from which patrols of Chindits fanned out in all directions. With the arrival of RAF Spitfires and American P-51s on Broadway, air protection was made available to cover operations. But the enemy struck back. 8 days after our troops had landed, Broadway was attacked by Zeros in a series of raids. American and British planes landed and took off within close range of the Japs. The enemy succeeded in capturing the far end of the field, but were held there by Allied ground and air fighters, their wings armed with bazookas. Died down as the guns of the enemy were silenced and its troops forced back into the jungle. General Wingate had paid one of his many visits to Broadway about this time. On his return flight to his base, his plane crashed in the jungle in Assam. Broadway, an airfield carved out of the jungle, stood as a fit memorial to General Charles Ord Wingate. Early in March, the Japs made an attempt to regain the initiative. They moved 3 divisions to the Chindwin River, crossed it, and struck at Imphal in India in a powerful pincer movement aimed at cutting the Bengal-Assam Railway, carrying supplies to the Allied troops in northern Burma. Headlines all over the world blazed the news that Jap armies were on Indian soil, that India had been invaded. The announcements, as usual, were premature. But the Allied situation, nevertheless, was extremely grave. Reinforcements were desperately needed. Once again, transports of the American Troop Carrier Command were called in. An entire 10 division with mules and supplies were carried 230 miles by air from one fighting front to another. By the beginning of April, one Japanese force was 8 miles from Imphal, while another had advanced on Kohima. They cut the roads surrounding Kohima, including the Manipur Road, the 14th Army's main supply line. At Kohima, a small hill station, a garrison of British and Indian infantry dug in and held on to a hill position overlooking the town. Conserving ammunition, the garrison held on. Daily transports brought over ammunition, food, water, and vital medical necessities. The hill soon became known to the troops as Parachute Hill. For 13 days, the garrison held out against a force 3 times its strength. Slowly, relieving forces began to arrive. Until finally, the infantry could take the initiative. The Jap had suffered a costly defeat. However, before the Jap attempt to cut their supply lines failed, the Lido force and the Marauders had continued their drive. The Chinese were now in the Mogong Valley, advancing on the important enemy supply base of Mogong. The Marauders, in their 700-mile march, were moving on the town of Michino, with its strategically valuable air base. The attack on Mogong began at dawn of the 23rd of June. The Chinese forces advanced from the north. While a Chindit force that had pushed up from Broadway struck from the southwest. By the second day, the railway station was occupied. Then, on the third day, the Chinese and Chindit forces linked up. Meanwhile, the Marauders, reinforced by Chinese troops, had marched for days in their drive toward the airfield at Michino. The enemy was apparently taken by surprise and withdrew to the town 2 miles east. Over the air went 2 words: cafeteria lunch. the code signal indicating that Michinaw Air Base was in Allied hands. Within 1 hour of its capture, gliders flew over, bringing engineers to repair and improve the field. They floated down to make rough and dangerous landings under fire from the town. The engineers went to work as Chinese troops manned defense positions around the field. The monsoon started and driving rain made the task of the engineers doubly difficult. Stilwell arrived for a conference with Merrill. Now, with the elimination of enemy interception from Michinaw, cargo planes could fly to Kunming in China on the southerly and more direct route, at lower altitudes and with increased tonnage. However, before the air base could be operated effectively, the enemy had to be routed from the town. Michinaw was pounded from the air by fighters and bombers. On the ground, American marauders and Chinese troops pounded the town with what little artillery they had. It was a long siege, 78 days, which finally ended in the complete destruction of the Jap forces defending the town. While the advance on Michinaw was taking place, the fourth Allied blow was struck. A thrust from the China-Burma border through the Salween River area by the Yunnan Chinese Expeditionary Force. The object of this blow was to clear the way for the eventual linking up of the Burma and Lido roads. To accomplish their task, two Jap strongholds, Lungling and Tengchung, had to be taken. On the morning of May 11th, the offensive started. 5 Chinese columns, together with a U.S. Army operations staff, crossed the Salween River. And moved on to the world's highest battleground, the Kaoli Mountains, spur of the Himalayas. For days, they struggled up precipitous slopes until they sighted one of their goals, Tengchung. The siege began. Jap soldiers driven from pillboxes streaked for cover, but machine guns picked them off as they ran. Chinese wounded were carried back over the wrecked walls. There were no Jap wounded, only dead, except for a handful of prisoners. Tengchung fell, then Lung Ling, and the Chinese and American flags flew over these two key strongholds. The B-29s that had come to China and India were striking at Burma, Sumatra, Java, Manchuria, flying the longest missions ever undertaken. Finally, they struck at the heart of the Japanese homeland and dropped their bombs on Tokyo. But the Japs struck back in a new China offensive. The American air bases that had been built in that country with such vast effort were in danger of being overrun by the enemy. There was barely time to destroy supplies and installations. One air base after another fell before the onslaught. Once again, roads and rails were packed with fleeing refugees. The offensive grew in strength until it had cut China in half. Now, unless supplies could be rushed through as never before, China faced total defeat. Tonnage over the hump was increased at a terrific rate. The pipeline that was already feeding the Allies in northern Burma pushed on so that it could feed the Allies in China. And on the Lido and Burma roads, with enemy opposition being cleared away, the engineers raced at top speed to reach the point where the two roads would meet. On a historic day in January, Brigadier, later Major General Pick, commander of the Lido Road construction, met Lieutenant General Dan I. Sultan, who had succeeded General Stilwell as commanding officer of the India-Burma Theater.
General Sultan, the Lido Road's open. We have a convoy formed. I'd like your permission to take it through to China.
The first convoy was on its way from India to China, across the 1,044 miles of the newly completed Lido-Burma Road, now called the Stillwell Road, in tribute to the man who had dedicated himself to the building of this great project. After a 24-day journey, the convoy arrived safely in Kunming. The Allies, British, Indian, Chinese, American, had fought and toiled and bled. And now at last, China's land bridge had been rebuilt. Aid had come to China.